Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining the California State Library's Government Publications section for a special program on Tule Lake National Monument with Danny Ortiz from the National Park Service. My name is Bradley Siebold, and I am the host of today's event. I am a librarian in the Government Publications section of the California State Library. Our moderator today, Emily Mackinson, is also a librarian in the Government Publications section. She will be monitoring our Q&A section for any questions you may have, and will read your questions during our Q&A session at the end of the presentation. The California State Library is thrilled to partner with the National Park Service to present today's program. Before we start, I have a bit of housekeeping to go over. If you have any questions during this presentation, please type them into the Q&A section. We will answer them at the end of the program. This presentation will be recorded and made available on the California State Library's YouTube channel. We will email the link to everyone who registered. Live transcription is enabled. Click the CC icon to show the captions. If you run into any technical difficulties during the presentation, please put those in the Q&A section and we will troubleshoot for you. We have added links related to the California State Library and Tule Lake National Monument in the chat window. For any state employees without a library card, please consider applying for one through the online application link. Now that the housekeeping is out of the way, let's get to the main event. Our speaker today is Danny Ortiz. Please join me in welcoming him. Danny Ortiz has been a park ranger at Tule Lake National Monument since 2018. He currently leads in-person tours at Tule Lake, including the historic jail and the historic Civilian Conservation Corps campsite. Without further ado, please welcome Danny Ortiz.
Hello. Well, give me 1 second so I can try and do the screen sharing. Okay. All right. Welcome to the talk. Let's see here. All right. So the history here begins well before World War II. There were laws in place that prevented Chinese immigrants from coming to the United States. So Japanese immigrants were able to come in and fill that workforce need. Now here on the West Coast, it was a lot of agriculture and a lot of farming. But a lot of people found it difficult to farm here on the West Coast. So a lot of people were struggling. Meanwhile, some of the Japanese immigrants that were coming from the West Coast were bringing in techniques that they had learned in Japan. So they were able to prosper and thrive while everyone else was struggling. And so in certain markets, they ended up taking over about 70% of the market. And so this led to a lot of the anti-Japanese sentiment here on the West Coast well before World War II even began. So certain laws would be passed saying you have to be a US citizen in order to own land. So if they had a child that was born here, they would put it in their child's name. So then another law would be passed saying you have to be 18 years or older in order to own land. So different techniques were being used to try and remove them from that land that everyone thought was worthless to begin with. Eventually World War II started and Pearl Harbor was attacked. Now, if you were of Japanese ancestry living in Hawaii and you were seen as a community leader, or if you had a fishing boat, or if you had a lot of correspondence back and forth with Japan, you may have been arrested. But for the most part, they left Hawaii alone because if they arrested everyone there, the entire economy there would have collapsed. Meanwhile, Executive Order 9066 was passed, which allowed General DeWitt to remove anyone from any piece of land that he felt was of military importance. So he declared that the entire West Coast was of military importance. So if you were outside of that evacuation zone, you would have essentially been fine. But if you were within that zone, you would have to deal with these evacuation orders. Now, there was such an anti-Japanese sentiment in California that California petitioned to make it the entire state rather than just along the coastline. So these posters were now being put up everywhere. The date at the top was the date that it's posted, and the date at the bottom was the date that the head of the household would have to go to these locations to get further instructions. In this instance, they were just given 2 days. Besides that, you will also see terminology on here like all Japanese persons, both alien and non-alien, where an alien would be an immigrant, somebody that's coming to this country, and a non-alien would be a US citizen. So it's a way for them to say that they were rounding up everyone, including US citizens, without actually saying US citizens. So when the head of the household goes to these locations, they were now given oops, a family number. Now, these numbers would be similar to a social security number, but rather than have one for each individual, you are now given one for your entire family. And one of the purposes behind this was to make sure that families were not being split up and that they were all going to the same location. But these tags weren't things that people just had to put on their suitcases, as people were forced to wear them. So from here, banks were now freezing their accounts. So the only way for them to come up with any money was to sell anything and everything they could. But since everyone knew that they were being removed from the coast, they were only giving them pennies on the dollar for anything that they were offering. So some people decided to sell their homes and their businesses to their neighbors for $1 in the hopes of buying it back after the war for $1. Now, some people were able to get their homes and businesses back, but not everyone was so lucky. If you refused to sell your home or your business, you were still required to pay on all of your bills and mortgages. But with your accounts frozen, there was no way to make those payments. So technically, the government didn't take anybody's properties. They had lost them, but with their accounts frozen, there was no way to be able to make those payments. Now, from here, they were then told that they were only allowed to take with them what they could carry. And in some instances, it would just be 2 suitcases. And if you had a baby in your arm, you'd be down to 1 suitcase. So what some people would do is that they would wear multiple layers of clothing so that they could bring more clothes with them. And in a lot of photographs, you'll see a lot of people wearing very fancy clothing and things like that. That was so they could bring those clothes with them. Now, from here, they were then loaded up on buses and in trains. And a lot of times those windows were closed out, so people had no idea where they were going. And they were then loaded up and taken to what were called assembly centers. Now, these assembly centers were basically just fairgrounds and racetracks where people were forced to stay in barns and in stables while the relocation centers were actually being built. And a lot of times those barns and stables weren't even cleaned out ahead of time. So people had to go in there and manually clean everything out themselves. Now, from here, they were then loaded up on buses and in trains again and taken to these 10 different war relocation centers. Now, these were supposed to be temporary relocation centers, with the idea being once the population was brought to these sites, they would then be released to states away from the coast where they would no longer be considered a threat. But the other states would reply with, prove to us that this individual can cross this imaginary line and is no longer a threat. The second you can prove that, we will take them. Until then, we don't want your California problem. So these temporary locations ended up becoming permanent. Now, a little history about the Tule Lake site. Everything around here used to be underwater as it was Tule Lake. It was drained at the turn of the century to bring in homesteaders and have people come and farm the land here. So when the government was looking for locations for these 10 sites, Tule Lake was ideal because it met all of the criteria. So it needed to be in a remote location. It needed to be owned by the government, and since they drained the lake, they owned the land. There needed to be transportation in place, and there was already a railroad system in place here. And it needed to be at least 10 miles from the nearest town. Now, the camp here is not quite 10 miles from the town of Tule Lake because where the camp was originally being built, it started to sink into the ground. So they just moved it over a bit. Now, when people first arrived to this site, they would have arrived to a large empty field as there was nothing here. So they were the ones that actually built the camp themselves. Now, they got so proficient at building those buildings that they would complete one in an hour. That's how fast those buildings were being completed. Now, those aren't fancy buildings with indoor plumbing and air conditioning. Those buildings were literally just made out of wood and tar paper for insulation. Um, Now, tar paper doesn't really do good for insulation as this area gets very, very hot in the summer and very, very cold in the winter. But besides that, it also gets very, very windy. And when the wind picks up, it picks up all that dust and creates dust storms. And so people wouldn't even be able to go inside their barracks to hide out from the storm, as a lot of the wood that they were using was green wood. And so what that means is when it dries, it starts to shrink and leave gaps in between. So when the wind picks up, the wind would come up through those gaps and get dust on everything. So there was no escaping it. So from here, these buildings were usually put together in what were called blocks. And I'm not sure if you folks can see this, but one of these squares here is a block. And so it would be rows of barracks and then a recreation hall, then rows of barracks and a mess hall. And down the middle would be the ironing room, the laundry room, the women's latrine, the men's latrine, and then the other women's latrine. Now, although these do look like they're large buildings here, if you were using the facilities, you would literally be sitting side by side with the person sitting next to you, with no partitions, no nothing between you and the other person sitting next to you. And if you were thinking, well, I'll just wait till there's no lines. Well, there were lines to use the restroom day and night. There was never a time where the restrooms were not being used. So what some people would do, especially in the wintertime where it would be freezing outside, is they would take a bucket with them into their barracks and use that as a latrine. And that way they can go and clean that out in the morning so they don't have to wait outside in the freezing temperatures. Now, the top corner over here was the mess hall. Now, the mess hall was twice the size of a normal barracks, but there were so many people in each block that they had to eat in shifts. So there would be multiple breakfasts, multiple lunches, multiple dinners. Now, on the other corner over here was the recreation hall. Now, each block would try and use a recreation hall for something different. So, for example, one block would use it for a school, another block would use it for a store, another block would use it for a church, and so on and so forth. Now, the entire site was about a mile and a half long by a mile and a half deep. And so this was when it became a segregation center, but I'll get to that in a second. So although the administration here did provide people with their housing and with their meals, if they needed anything else like baby formula, they had to pay for that themselves. And the only way for them to do that was if they had a job. Now, there wasn't enough work to go around for everybody here, but if they were lucky enough to be able to get one of the jobs, chances are that they would be working out in the field or in the hog and chicken farm. But they did have jobs in the administration area as well as secretaries and working as mechanics in the garages, as well as firefighters or as security at night. Now, they were being paid, but they were being paid amongst the lowest you were legally allowed to pay people, which is on the military wage scale. Now, to put that into perspective, if these people were doing this exact same work on the outside of the camp, they could make anywhere from 3 to 10 times as much money doing the exact same work. Now, besides this, They also had different forms of entertainment here, as they did have some freedoms. So they had Harvest Day festivals, Labor Day festivals, sumo wrestling tournaments, judo tournaments. They had the American Boy Scouts. They had baseball teams that traveled around and played some of the local teams. Besides that, they also had a mountain that was just next to the camp here called Castle Rock, and people would be able to go up there to go hiking on the weekends, and in the winter times they could go up there to go sledding. But just because they had some forms of entertainment doesn't mean that these were great places to be, as these were camps surrounded by barbed wire fences that had guard towers, that had the military at the top of them, that had machine guns pointed in at the people in the camps. Now, I do want to make one thing perfectly clear, is that these sites were nowhere near as bad as what was happening over in Europe, as those were death camps. These were nowhere near that bad. But just because they weren't that bad doesn't mean that these were great places to be. Now, the history with this location and the other 9 relocation centers is very, very similar until the questionnaire comes out. That's where the history at this location changes drastically. So the military realized that there was a large population of US citizens in these campsites, as 2/3 were US citizens. And so they wanted to see if any of them wanted to help fight in the war. So the military came up with this questionnaire. Now, there was a lot of arbitrary questions on here, but there was only 2 questions that mattered, number 27 and 28. So number 27 is, are you willing to serve in the armed forces of the United States on combat duty wherever ordered? It's basically, are you willing to join the armed forces? Number 28, will you swear unqualified allegiance to the United States of America and faithfully defend the United States from any or all attack by foreign or domestic forces, and forswear any form of allegiance or obedience to the Japanese emperor or any other foreign government, power, or organization? It's basically saying, are you willing to pledge allegiance to the United States? So this questionnaire was supposed to be given to people in the camps if they were a US citizen and if they were a man that was within the draft age. And if you would have answered yes, yes to both of these questions, you may have been drafted into the 442nd, which is the highest decorated military unit in US history. And that is mainly due to the fact that they were being sent to some of the worst battles in Europe. And they, a lot of them felt that they had to fight harder than anybody else because they needed to prove that they belonged in this country. And some people felt that they had to fight harder than that. If they fought hard enough, that maybe their families would be released from these sites. Now, the people running these sites, they saw this questionnaire and thought, if this is good enough to prove that they are loyal and can join the armed forces, then this is good enough to prove that they're loyal, and we can now start releasing them from the camps. This is the proof that we can show the other states. So this was now given to everybody in the site, in the camps here. Didn't matter if you were a US citizen or not, didn't matter if you were a man or not. As long as you were 17 years or older, you had to fill this out. The problem is, if you ask a 90-year-old woman if she wants to join the army, she might not want to say yes to that question. Besides that, some people were Japanese citizens that didn't speak any English and had their children translate this for them. So some people thought that question 28 was asking them to sign away their Japanese citizenship so that they would have no rights. Besides that, some people that were US citizens thought number 28 was a trick question, because how can I forswear my loyalty to the Japanese emperor if I never had loyalty to the Japanese emperor? It's a trick question. Besides that, you also had some people that were nonviolent and wouldn't have fought anybody regardless of who you put in front of them. And there were some people that were just starting families and thought that if they were to go off to go fight in the war, that there would be nobody to help provide for their families. And you also had some people that felt, how dare you ask me to go fight and defend this country after you've taken everything from me and my family and stuck us in these camps behind barbed wire fences? So there was a lot of reasons why someone would not have answered yes, yes to these 2 questions. So if you would have answered yes, yes, you were considered loyal to the United States. If you refused to answer, if you answered no, no, if you answered yes, no, even if you answered yes, yes, but put an addendum on there, like if I'm allowed to leave the camps, then all of those people were considered disloyal to the United States. There was one incident of a gentleman here that said that he would be willing to sign yes, yes to both of these questions if he was allowed to stand outside of the gate for 5 minutes so he could feel like a free man. And the guards did not comply with his request, and so he refused to answer yes, yes to these two questions. So, some of the other relocation centers realized that people were having issues understanding these questions, and so they changed it to be easier to be understood to something like, are you willing to obey all US laws? Which is very easy to understand as opposed to how these questions are written. As number 28 is about 4 questions in one. Now, Tule Lake did not change its questionnaire and left it as is. Because of that, this site had the highest percentage of people that did not answer yes, yes. It was over 40%. Because of that, this location was now designated the Tule Lake Segregation Center. And so more barbed wire fences went up, more guard towers went up, more freedoms were restricted, and this site became the worst site to be in. So if you were at one of the other locations and did not answer yes, yes, you were brought to Tule Lake. If you were at Tule Lake and answered yes, yes, you had the option to go to one of the other locations. But if you had a job here, there was no guarantee there would be a job waiting for you at one of the other locations. Besides that, some people were sick and tired of being moved around, and they decided to just stay put and write it out. The problem was the administration didn't separate between this is the loyal side and that's the disloyal side. This just became the disloyal camp. Regardless of how you answered, you now had that stigma attached to you. This is when people from the other locations started coming to Tule Lake, and the population exploded to over 18,000 people, making it the largest out of all 10 sites. And the administration didn't anticipate the giant influx of people to this location. And so there were now food shortages at this site, and people were living off of tofu for the majority of their meals. And so some people coming from the other sites saw how much better they were being treated at the previous locations versus how they were now being treated here. And they were starting to become more and more disillusioned with the United States. And so some of them ended up forming a group called the Hoshidan. Now, some people were joining this group because they wanted to learn how to read and write in Japanese, learn their history, learn their culture. On the other hand, you had some people that were joining this group because they were US citizens and they knew their rights had been violated. And so they would do things like shave their heads, wear the same outfits, and do exercise at the crack of dawn right in front of the administration building as a form of protest. Now, during one of these protests, supposedly a riot broke out, and because of that, the administration brought in a military battalion of over 1,000 soldiers and their tanks and declared martial law in the camp here. And so this is when they started going up and down all the barracks, raiding everything, looking for contraband, and interrogating the people in the camp. And this is when the history here gets very dark for the people in the camp. So because of these incidences, the administration decides to build a concrete jail in the camp. So out of all 10 sites, this is the only one that has a concrete jail built into it. Now, it is believed that the first people being thrown in there were the leaders of the Hoshidan group, and there was no trial, no nothing, as people were just grabbed and being thrown in here. But the members of the Hoshidan group weren't the only ones being thrown in here, as there was an incident where this lady had a record player, and the record player played both radio and records, but incoming transmission was against the rules, so they always had it set to the record player. Now, her neighbor wanted to borrow the record player, so they took it from one barracks to the other. They turned it on, and the radio started playing. She quickly turns it off, but it was too late. The guards already heard it. So the guards come bursting in there, and they start yelling at her, "What's going on? What are you doing?" But she was a first-generation immigrant that didn't speak any English, so she started pointing to the record player. The guards grabbed this record player, see that there's a barracks and an address on there, so they go to that barracks and start yelling at that lady. But she was also a first-generation immigrant. Now, at this time, her son is at work and he comes home for lunch. And as soon as he enters the barracks, he sees his mom arguing with the guards. As soon as they see him, they start yelling at him. He has no idea what's going on. He gets arrested. He speaks both English and Japanese. He must be the mastermind. So he gets thrown in the jail and he's interrogated for about a week and a half. Now, he never changes his story this whole time because he doesn't know what the story is. Eventually, the guards realize he really doesn't know anything and they let him go. It's not until he gets out that he talks with his mom that he finds out why he was thrown in here. And this is just one of hundreds of stories of people just being thrown into this building. Now, around the time that the other thing about the jail was that this building was supposed to hold 24 people at a time, but there were times where there were over 100 people being held in here. And you can see in this bottom left photo that a lot of the beds were just being lined up along the wall there so they can try and get as many people in here as possible. Now, around the time that this jail was being built, a new law came out that says if your country of origin is in a war with the United States, you can sign away your citizenship and they will ship you off to your home country. So this was originally geared towards German and Italians. But the people in this camp, they were being told that nobody wants you here. There's nothing for you here. The only chance you have to survive is to sign away your citizenship and hope that you can start your life again over in Japan. So some people started to sign away their citizenships. Now, around the same time, if anyone wanted to take a tour of the camp, like a newspaper reporter or the sheriff, they would get a very fake tour. They would go to one specific block where everyone was told, you have to be happy, you have to be in a good mood, and if you participate, you're going to get a big steak dinner, where the alternative would have been tofu because there was food shortages. So every time somebody comes in, everybody's singing, they're dancing, they're having a great time, they're eating steak, they're eating better than I'm eating. And that gets reported over and over and over again. So now what the public is being told is that, yes, the people at the other 9 relocation centers are still loyal to the United States, but the ones in this camp, they hate the United States so much that they're willing to sign away their citizenship so that they could go to Japan, so they could come back and fight us, even though they're being treated better than the average US citizen. So as these rumors are starting to grow, eventually a lawyer from San Francisco named Wayne Collins makes his way up here. And he finds out how people are actually being treated, and he finds out the lies that they're being told. And he tells them the truth that if you want to stay in this country, you can stay in this country. You don't have to go to Japan. If you do want to go to Japan, you don't have to sign away your citizenship, because if you sign it away, that means you can't come back. So how many of you want to stay? And the majority did want to stay, as they were born and raised in this country. A lot of them had never even been to Japan before. So this lawyer files a class action lawsuit to try and get all of their citizenships back. He's told by the courts, no, you have to do it on a case-by-case basis. So he ends up taking on thousands of cases and works on them for decades. So the war now starts coming to an end. The other 9 relocation centers have all closed down, but Tule Lake is still open for months after the war. People are now scared to leave because they've signed away their citizenship, and they feel the safest thing is for them to just stay put while this lawyer deals with all of their legal issues. So this lawyer starts filing injunction after injunction to keep the camp open, but the government starts getting upset, as these were supposed to be temporary relocation centers. They weren't supposed to be open for the duration of the war. They're not supposed to be open after the war. Shut it down. So people were given a train ticket to wherever they wanted to go and a $20 voucher. The problem was that a lot of people had nothing to return home to, as they had lost everything when they got brought to these sites. And besides that, there was still a large anti-Japanese sentiment on the West Coast. And this is when people started to move east, some as far as the East Coast. And besides that, no one ever talked about their times in these camps, especially Tule Lake, because this site had such a negative stigma attached to it that if somebody found out you were from this location, they would wonder, what are you up to? So a lot of people started to move to areas where they were the only Japanese family in a specific neighborhood. So that way, some of their neighbors wouldn't grow suspicious as to what this large group is coming in for. Okay. So a long time since no one started to talk about this, they had a saying that was shikata ga nai, which basically means it can't be helped. It does no good dwelling on the past. Let's just move forward. So for a long time, the history here began to fade away. Now, this is where most people assume the history at this location ends, but eventually there were rumors that these sites were going to be reopened and used to house members of the Communist Party and members of the Black Panther Party. And so eventually a book came out called Concentration Camps USA, which alerted the public about this history and that this had occurred during World War II and that these camps existed. And as people started to learn about this, this is when the Japanese community finally started to speak up and tell their stories. And this is when this new generation started to learn that these sites had actually been a part of their family history. As there was one individual that was here that told us that every time he would go to his grandmother's house, he would always see that she had two suitcases with clothes in them ready to go. And he would always offer to put those clothes away and go put her suitcases away. And she would always say, no, 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 that's okay. Just leave it where it is. And he didn't understand why she had those suitcases. And he always thought that that just must be some weird Japanese thing that he doesn't understand. It wasn't until he learned about this history that he realized that she had those suitcases packed and ready to go in case something like this ever happened again. So, as this new generation started to learn more and more about this history, a lot of them started to become activists, and some of them helped overturn Title II of the McCarran Act, which officially shut down these sites so they could no longer be used. Um, some of them helped overturn the law that allowed people to sign away their citizenship. Um, the problem was that if you had signed away your citizenship during World War II, there's a chance you may have been repatriated over to Japan, where you would have arrived to nothing but destruction and discrimination, as the people there said, you may look like us, but you are American. You are not one of us. And a lot of people ended up starving out in the streets. And it was virtually impossible to get a hold of any of them to let them know that they had gotten their citizenships back. So from here, that community now started to write more books and started to tell their stories. In the 70s, people started to have pilgrimages back to this location and more openly talk about their experiences and started to spread the word a lot more. In the 80s, oh, I don't have that picture. In the 80s, President Reagan signed what was essentially an apology letter and tried to financially compensate some of the survivors. The problem was that those that had lost the most got nothing for their trouble, as they were the older generation who had worked their entire lives, lost everything when they got brought to these sites. And when they were here, they lost everyone's respect because the administration did not want to deal with that first generation Issei. They wanted to deal with that younger generation, the Nisei, since they were more Americanized. So now everyone was going to that second generation rather than the older generation. And so, besides that, when they were at these locations, the family dynamic completely broke down because if you didn't want to go eat with your family, you go eat with your friends. If you didn't want to go to school, you go play baseball because who's going to stop you? And besides that, when they left these sites, a lot of them were too old to start their lives over again and relied on their children to survive. And a lot of them died well before the 80s. So even though they lost the most, they got nothing for their trouble. Now, the land here started changing hands between different government agencies, and it eventually becomes a part of the World War II Valor in the Pacific National Monument. Now, the original home base is in Hawaii, so there are other locations like in Alaska, but that made it very hard to get any kind of funding for us to do anything here. But as of a couple of years ago, we are now officially the Tule Lake National Monument. So we're now officially our own national monument, which is how we were able to afford our brand new visitor center that has been open for about 2 years at this point. And so things have definitely been getting much better at spreading the word for the locals here, as a lot of these younger generations are starting to learn a lot about what actually happened here, where some of the older generation may be a little more resilient to the information that we have available. Now, what I usually tell people is if you learned anything here today, please spread the word, as the further east you go, the less likely someone is to even know of this history. But if you do, just be careful of the terminology that you use, as some people may be offended, as a lot of people refer to these sites as internment camps, where that is technically incorrect, where internment camps are for enemy aliens, where the people in these sites, 2/3 were US citizens, and no one was ever officially convicted of any crimes, so no one was an enemy or an alien. Some people refer to these sites as J camps, which I'm not going to say the slur, and some people refer to these sites as concentration camps, which this does meet the definition of a concentration camp, but there was pushback from the Jewish community on the East Coast in the 70s that they were worried that people were going to assume that what was happening here was the exact same thing that was happening over in Europe, where it was much, much worse over in Europe. So the agreed upon term was American concentration camps, but I always refer to them by the names on their legal documents. So the Tule Lake Relocation Center and the Tule Lake Segregation Center. But I always tell people a rose by any other name is still a camp surrounded by barbed wire fences. At this point, I would like to talk a little bit about the Civilian Conservation Corps campsite, which I don't have a picture of it right now. So there is a camp that is about 15 miles from our location here. It was a Civilian Conservation Corps campsite. So the CCC was a group that was created by the government to try and get the United States out of the Great Depression before World War II. And they actually helped build some of the roads in this local area. And so when World War II started, not a lot of people were signing up to go join the CCC because everyone was joining to go into the military to go fight the war. So that camp was left abandoned. So when World War II started and Pearl Harbor was attacked, the relocation center was built, and then eventually the questionnaire came out. And so the first 100 people or so that refused to answer the questionnaire were taken to some of the local jails. When they got put in front of a judge, the judge said that they did not break any laws, so you cannot keep them in the jails. So get them out. So rather than bring everyone back to the Tule Lake Relocation Center where they could spread the word that you don't have to fill out the questionnaire, they kept them over at the CCC camp. That way they keep the two groups separate. The people at the relocation center can finish filling out the questionnaire. And eventually some of the people at the CCC camp got taken to some of the Department of Justice facilities, but eventually most of them did make their way back to the relocation center. That was the first time that that site was used. The second time that that site was used was when they started to bring in strike breakers. So when the Tule Lake Relocation Center eventually became a segregation center, and the people from the other camps started to come to this location, the population exploded. Their farmers that were at this location were upset because they were growing vast quantities of food, seeing it loaded up on trains and go to the other camps because the administration had contracts with some of the other camps. And then the farmers were being told that there's not enough food for you. So a lot of the farmers were already upset. And so one day there was a vehicle that flipped over and killed one of the workers. And so the farmers decided to go on strike. And their demands were that they wanted more food to stay in the camp, they wanted safer equipment, and they wanted a pay increase as they were being paid amongst the lowest of the people at that camp. So the reason why they were asking for those additional things was if you go into negotiations, you have to be willing to give something up. So they could give up the pay increase and they could give up the safer equipment, but they needed more food to stay in the camp. The next day, the administration comes out and fires everybody. So they start sending messages to the other relocation centers that Tule Lake needs help harvesting. Send whoever you can. So farmers at this location were being paid about $12 a month, but what they were offering these people was $1 an hour. So you could essentially earn in one day what it would normally take you an entire hour to earn. But rather than keep people at the main camp where they would find out they're strike breakers and actually hurting the people in the camp there, they kept them over at Camp Tule Lake. That way, you keep the two groups separate. The people at the CCC camp are under the impression that they're only here to help, and they don't realize they're actually hurting the people right down the road. So after that harvest season ends, they send everyone back to the camps that they came from. And that was the second time that that site was used. The last time that that site was used was when they started to bring in German and Italian POWs. So the local area here is a big farming community. Before the war started, they kept petitioning the government to let more migrant workers in because not enough people were making all the way up here to Northern California. So when the relocation center was being built, the locals were being told that you will be able to use that workforce. Now, when that site became a segregation center, the locals were now being told you can no longer use that workforce. They cannot be trusted. Here's some POWs and high-ranking officials and fighter pilots. It's okay for them to go out in the field. So they were brought to the CCC camp, and they were allowed to actually be used as farm laborers for the local farmers. And so the German and Italian POWs were actually being treated much, much better than the US citizens of Japanese ancestry that were right down the road. As when a lot of them were working out in the fields, if they had less than 10 POWs in that field, they wouldn't have a guard out in that farmland. So if you were a farmer there, you could now offer these people an incentive to work harder. So people are being offered things like chocolates and cakes. If you do a good job, you'll have a pie waiting for you. So because of this, a lot of the POWs started to get along very, very well with the locals. They got along so well that some of them even dated some of the locals. Now, they got along so well that after the war ended and some of them got sent back to Europe, some of them did make their way back here to the area to try and enter the raffle to win some of the land. Now, only two of them qualified, but none of them actually won some of the land here. I did hear rumors that some of them settled in some of the surrounding area, but I don't know how true that is. But that was the third time that Civilian Conservation Corps campsite was used. And that was the last time that site was used. I really don't know how to end this presentation, so I think we can start opening it up to questions if you're all okay with that.
Great. Thank you, Danny Ortiz, for sharing this important information about California and our history. Now we'll open it up for questions. If you have any questions for Danny, please type them into the Q&A box now if you haven't already done so. Emily Mackinson, did we have any questions that came in during the presentation?
Hi, Bradley. Yes, thank you. We did have quite a few questions come in, and we have some more coming in right now as well. The first question, someone asked, So if someone had Japanese heritage alongside another ethnicity, for example, maybe they were half Japanese, would they still be considered a threat and placed into the camp?
Yes, so as long as you had at least 25% in you, you would have been brought to one of these sites. And it didn't matter if you were a baby or an orphan, they took children from orphanages to bring them into the camps.
Was there any pushback from their non-Japanese family?
Um, I don't know for sure, but I would assume that there would have been.
Yeah. Yeah, that sounds really intense. So you mentioned that the 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 Japanese Americans came from the areas on the West Coast in the military exclusion area. Were there many Japanese Americans living in the states not in the West Coast? Um, and how did they respond to uh,
So there were some people living east of the exclusion zone. And like I said before, there were some in Hawaii as well. And not all of them outside of that area knew that this was happening on the West Coast, as I have met people that were living in Hawaii at the time. And after the war, they had communications with their families that were in the camp, but that family never brought up any of that history. So they never knew until decades later that their own family had gone through this. Um, so yeah, a lot of people on the outside of the exclusion zone may not have even known that this history happened.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions about the Hoshidan groups that were at Tule Lake. Someone asked, were there Hoshidan groups at any of the other location centers in California?
I don't believe so. I think that group was started when people were coming to this location, as this is where they butted heads quite a bit with the administration, as a lot of the people that were not willing to answer yes to that questionnaire, they were brought to this location, and those were the people that butted heads with the administration. There were people in the camp that were upset at the Hoshidan, as well, as some of them felt that they were rocking the boat too much, and if they just um, just write it out, it'll be an easier experience for everyone. But um, the fact that the Hoshidan was being so adamant about this, that they were making it worse for everyone in the camp. So even within the camp, it was kind of like a little bit of a back and forth argument within the groups there.
Thank you. We have a few questions about the jail building that you talked about. One person asks, is the concrete jail building in Newell, California? I've seen the wooden buildings on Tule Lake on Hill Road, but I've only seen a cement building related to the camp in Newell.
Okay, so the buildings on Hill Road, those are the Civilian Conservation Corps camp buildings. That is not where the main camp was. The main camp was in the town of Newell. So the big concrete building that's there, that is the jail. Um, Now that building has had a lot of restoration done to it, because after the war ended, it was like a big empty building. A lot of the steel had been sold off. And so where a lot of the steel doors were, there was just giant holes where they had to chip into the wall to take the doors out. Um, but there was one family that actually worked in the camp and during the war, and so they bought a lot of that steel, and then saved it in their garage for decades. And then after this site became a part of the National Park Service, they actually donated all that steel that they were able to purchase to the national park, and we've been able to put all that back in place. So a lot of the steel that's in there is original steel. So a lot of the photos that you would see, if they were before COVID had happened, you would see giant holes in the walls and things like that there. But yeah, we do tours to that location. That is the only building that we do tours in at the moment.
Thank you. Can you talk about the two stockades at the jail site?
Yeah. Am I still sharing my screen or not yet?
It doesn't look like you're sharing it anymore.
Okay, let me. Okay. Um, okay, can you all see my cursor here, my mouse?
Yes.
No? Okay. So this is something that I just found out recently. So over in the administration area, the National Monument is just this tiny little section right here. So we are a very small portion of the whole site. But the first stockade would have been over in this area over here, I believe. This over here is the hospital. But in this original stockade, um, I know that they had a couple of tents there, like teepees. Um, and I don't know if any barracks were there in this location. Um, but I have heard some stories where they would put some of the people there in that stockade area kind of as a form of punishment. And there was one individual that had a blanket that every morning he would have to throw it on top of the teepee and hope that it thaws during the day so he could use it again that night because it had been frozen solid. And so in this area, it gets very, very cold in the winter. It does snow, and even in the barracks, it would have been very, very cold. And I couldn't imagine how much colder it would have been inside one of those little teepee buildings, as it wasn't an actual building. But that was the first stockade. The second stockade was this one that was later in the war. And so it is right next to where the concrete jail is, which is this building right here. Now, these barracks here, these buildings were brought from this section over here. So this area got built much quicker as there was basically 4 barracks that they used for the stockade area. So there was one barracks right here, another one below that. There was this full barracks here with a half barracks behind it. Now this was the mess hall. And the other half was over in this direction. And this is where the latrine would have been. And there would have been guard towers on each of the corners here. And this here was basically a chain linked fence. And then the other line above it, going next to the jail here, was a big wooden fence. So people from the camp wouldn't be able to see into the area over here. But yeah, this was the second stockade area. And this is the area where a lot of people that had signed away their citizenships were brought into the camp from this side gate here. They were marched in this direction and then marched down this way to be held into the jail. And at one point, I know that there was a strike that was held here where some of the individuals, I forget the term of it, where they don't make any effort to be moved to other locations. So they had to be, or they were dragged out by some of the immigration officers that were here. And then they dragged people out in this direction, brought them out this way, and then started marching in this direction, as we do have some photographs of that. So they could go to the trains before they were sent to Bismarck. Yeah, did that answer that question?
I think so. Thank you. Another question. What was the relationship between the U.S. government and the Siskiyou County indigenous people at the time of the Tule Lake Segregation Center being established? How did tribal nations around the camp area view these activities, interface with the camps, or how have they been involved in management or reclamation of camp lands that are part of their traditional territories?
Ooh, that's a good question. So I don't know too much of what their opinion would have been during the war, as that's a lot of that's a bit of a complicated history, dealing with the Modoc tribe being essentially split into two, where one group ended up going out to Oklahoma, I believe, and the other half being integrated into the Klamath tribe. And so I don't really know how I would be able to answer that question, unfortunately. Honestly, I don't even know if I'm allowed to answer it if I even knew the answer to that question.
Thank you.
Yeah, sorry about that.
No worries. Can you speak to some of the motivations for Japanese people to immigrate to the US? Were they from a particular region or a particular group in Japan? And what was the situation in Japan like prior to World War II?
I don't know too much about this particular question. I do know that a lot of people were moving to this location because they felt that this was a huge opportunity to try and improve their lot in life. I know a lot of the women that were coming over were what were called picture brides. I actually had a conversation with a gentleman that said that his mother was one of these women that was came over, and she was from a like a higher society type of individual that had servants and things like that. And when she came to the United States and she married this farmer, she had to learn how to cook, and it was something that she was not fond of, as she never had to do it before. And when they got brought into the camp, the only thing that she really felt relief for was that she didn't have to cook anymore, as there was somebody else doing it. Not that this situation was good for anybody being brought here, but that's also something that you'll hear about some of the children when they come into this camp, that they are glad that they don't have to do any more farm chores anymore. But you know, a lot of the kids were being shielded from the truth of like what was really happening, because who's really telling their kids, like the children don't really understand the severity of the situation, whereas the adults realize that, oh, they lost everything and got brought to these campsites, so it definitely hits them a lot harder. um, but yeah, I think that's the most detail I can really give on that question, unfortunately.
Thank you, Danny. Could you elaborate a little more on the about the Japanese US citizens who were deported to Japan and the discrimination that they faced there?
Unfortunately, I can't give too much information about that. I haven't been able to do too much research on that, as um, a lot of the people that were uh, going back to Japan, I know there were instances where some of them tried to locate some of their families that were in Japan. But even in post World War II, war torn Japan, even the people that were originally there struggled pretty hard after the war, trying to rebuild their lives from scratch. And then to have this burden of another family member coming in was a lot for people. Um, but I don't know too much on that end, unfortunately.
Thank you. Were any of the guards who worked at the camp Japanese Americans or were fluent in Japanese?
I don't know too much about the guards here. I have met people that have had family that was a part of the guards here or working in the administration area. Um, but I haven't heard too much about the administration side knowing Japanese.
Thank you. We have someone who asked, what is the best way to find specific people who were at the camp? Or do you know how they can look up a number attached to a family name?
Oh, yeah. So if you had family that was in these any of the 10 relocation centers, you can always send us an email, and we can forward you a document that you can fill out, send that into the government, and they will send you any information that the War Relocation Authority would have had on your family. So the WRA was basically the group that was created specifically to handle these 10 sites. So all the records that they have, you would be able to get any information that they would have had on your family. So from my understanding, it's things like family number, barracks addresses, if they had any jobs, or if they were in the hospital for whatever reason, or any type of records that the WRA would have had. So yeah, if you send us an email, make sure to ask for the family information request documents or something like that, and we'll go ahead and forward those documents to you.
Great, thank you so much. We have a question from someone who sounds like they have visited in the past. They say, I took many pictures of the jail graffiti. Is there anywhere National Park Service or someone else who has photos of these or translations or more information about the graffiti at the jail?
We do have translations of most of it, I believe. We currently do not have any of those photos on our website, as I am currently the only Tule Lake National Monument employee. And over the past couple of years, I've been trying to organize them and put them on the website. So the stuff that we have on the website is what we've done so far. There are a lot of photos that are of inside the jail that we're working on to get onto the website. Even photos that were of inside the jail during World War II. Stuff like the construction, some of the stuff of people being held in there, and some of the graffiti that could be seen in modern times. But it may be a while before I'm able to get to that to be able to put it on the website.
Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
At the beginning of your presentation, you showed a map with two different zones. Um, and one's labeled prohibited zone, and this attendee wants to know more about those two different zones shown on the map.
Unfortunately, I haven't been able to do too much research into that yet. I'm still learning quite a bit. But yeah, that is something that is on my list of things that I need to dig deeper into.
Okay, thank you. What agricultural practices were brought from Japan, and why were they more successful?
I don't know all of them. I have heard stuff like planting certain types of berries and things like under trees, so you could essentially grow like whatever the fruit the tree is growing, as well as another type of plant near the tree, so it like uses the shade from that. Uh, but yeah, I honestly don't really know anything about agriculture. I know this is a big farming community, but I honestly have no idea about what makes good farming techniques or not. But that is one of the ones that I heard about.
Great, thank you. How many buildings still exist at the site?
Ooh, let's see. Can I share my screen again? Let's see. Go. Okay. So on site that haven't been moved, there is the carpenter shop, which is this building right here. It's right next to our visitor center, which would be right here. This is an original building in its original location. There is the concrete jail. There are these two garages that are over here. I believe there is one building that's over in this area, but I don't know for sure. There are these buildings over here. I believe they're currently being used for potato storage or something like that. There is the sewage treatment building over here, the other sewage treatment building over here. And in modern times, there's a road that comes up this way and cuts across this direction. And you can see some of the foundation for some of these buildings. Now, as for the rest of these buildings where the barracks were, after the war ended, the War Relocation Authority tried to reuse as much of the material on the campus possible. So they would take these buildings, cut them in half, and raffle them off to incoming homesteaders. So these buildings are all over the area around here. As I believe they only charge people for like shipping and handling or something like that. But yeah, these buildings are all over the area, and a lot of people are using them to this day as like garages or sheds or things like that. And I know the local fairgrounds in the town of Tule Lake has an original barracks and an original guard tower. So if you're ever in the area and wanted to see what those buildings look like, yeah, you could definitely see two of those right there.
Great, thank you.
Mhm.
This attendee asks, what was the name of the lawyer that helped them gain or retain American citizenship after the war?
Wayne Collins.
Wayne Collins?
Yeah, Wayne Collins.
How much of this history is being taught in California and the United States today? And what lessons can we take from our history to try to prevent repeating it?
So it really depends on who you have as a history teacher. I grew up in Southern California, but I don't remember being taught this. Although I have met people from the East Coast that already did a lot of this research before they came to this site. And this was someone that had no connection to this location. So it was really because they had a teacher that had taught them this. But besides that, we are getting a lot of school groups that come to this area to take the tour here to get a lot of information. So a lot of the local kids are definitely learning this history, but it really depends on who you have as a history teacher. And as for like what we can do to make sure this doesn't happen again, I'm a government employee and I don't think I'm allowed to have opinions on such matters.
Okay, well, thank you.
Mhm.
Um, is the National Park Service looking for volunteers, or is it possible to volunteer remotely with Tule Lake, I am guessing, or any of the park services?
Yes, we are constantly looking for volunteers. Like I mentioned before, right now I'm kind of the only park ranger here at this location, as we are run by the Lava Beds National Monument. Um, so there have been times where I literally have to close down the visitor center to go do the tour. But if we have volunteers here, I know we've had an intern last year that was actually working here, but we found out she lived in the East Coast near where the National Archives is, and we had found that one of the collections out over there had photos that were of this location that I've never seen before from photographers that I wasn't familiar with. And so at the end of her season, like the last week, we sent her home to be able to go to those locations to be able to scan those for us. Now that was a very lucky situation. So I don't know if we would be able to have something like that ever happen again, but there's a ton of documents in a lot of those national archives that haven't been scanned or that are on original film that hasn't been scanned that one, we would need to get scanned so we could digitize, and two, actually have people go through those documents and understand what they're looking at to be able to place them in the right, to be able to make sense of what they're looking at. because there's a lot of documents with a lot of information that is really confusing if you don't know what you're looking at. But yes, we're always looking for volunteers, even remote volunteers.
Thank you so much. So we're getting to the end of our Q&A time. If you have any more questions, attendees that we have not answered, please feel free to drop those in the chat and we will reach out to Danny later. Or if you think of any questions after this program, you can email the State Library at cslgps@library.ca.gov. Just one final question. What is the best time of year to visit Tule Lake National Monument? And is there anything visitors should know before visiting?
Well, so the last question is the weather here can change at the drop of a hat. So there have been different points in history where it has snowed, like in August or July. So if you call in October asking me what the weather's going to be like, 4th of July weekend, I have no idea. It can really change. Okay, as for when we're open, we're basically open while I'm employed here. So I'm a seasonal that comes back every summer. So it's usually Labor Day to Memorial Day. Those are the days that we're usually guaranteed to be open. But I do have Tuesdays and Wednesdays off, as those are my days off. So those are the days that the visitor center itself is closed. But if you wanted to do a tour or anything like that, even in the off season, you can always call the Lava Beds National Monument and request a tour. As since this site is closed, there will be no rangers on site, so you can get someone from the Lava Beds to come down to this location and actually give you a tour. Yeah, any time of year, if you wanted to take a tour or something like that, I always recommend you call in advance. But even in the summer, if you just show up, if there are spots available for tours, you can always just jump on in. It's no problem usually.
Great. Thank you so much for answering those questions, Danny. Unfortunately, that's all the time that we have for questions today. But thank you so much for sharing all this information with us.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, thank you again to Danny Ortiz for your informative presentation. Thank you to Emily Mackinson for monitoring our Q&A, and thank you all for attending. If you're ever in the area, please visit the State Library at 914 Capitol Mall in Sacramento, Monday through Friday from 9:30 a.m. to 4 p.m. Our library actually has manuscripts and primary source material from incarcerated people in our California history section collection, and materials from the War Relocation Authority in our government publications section. You can send us questions via phone, email, and the Ask a Librarian web form on our homepage. If you haven't already, you can still register for our next presentations. Lava Beds National Monument and the Modoc War on July 23rd at noon, and also on August 8th, our presentation about Channel Islands National Park. Also, please make sure to visit a local national park or national monument soon. Thank you for all being here and have a great rest of your day.